My husband bought his secretary a house. That house was built on the same spot where my family's old property once stood. From its windows, you could see the small, humble apartment where we first started our business. On the day I got into a car accident, he was busy celebrating his secretary's housewarming party. I called him 65 times, only to receive a curt reply, "Emily, I'm really busy. Don't bother me." I found out Derek was cheating because his secretary accidentally sent me a message. My husband and I had a couple's profile picture on our chat app, so she must have sent it to me by mistake. The message read, "Boss, why didn't your old lady bring you lunch today?" Derek has a sensitive stomach, so I've been bringing him homemade meals every single day for the past 15 years, without fail. We grew our business from a tiny apartment into a towering office building. Every time I showed up at his office, he would hug me and whisper, "Emily, marrying you is the greatest blessing of my life." 2 minutes passed, and the message wasn't retracted. Then, she sent another one. "Sorry, sis-in-law, I sent the message to the wrong person. My bad." It felt less like an apology and more like a provocation. I was standing outside the office building with a steaming bowl of chicken soup in my hands, but I suddenly felt cold, as if the past 15 years had been nothing but a cruel joke. Just then, Derek called me. His voice was as gentle as ever. "Honey, I'm starving. Why haven't you brought me lunch yet?" My hands trembled as I hung up. I quickly opened the secretary's social media page, hoping to find a clue. I didn't even need to look far. Pinned to the top was a photo of hands holding a bouquet of roses. On the inside of one hand was a faint tattoo of the letters LY. The ink had faded, but I recognized those hands instantly. They were Derek's. The last time he gave me flowers was over 10 years ago. Derek came downstairs to meet me. He wrapped his arm around my shoulder and took the chicken soup from my hands. "Honey, your cooking is amazing," he said. But before he could finish, his eyes froze on the screen of my phone. The words caught in his throat, and after a long pause, he stammered, "Emily, you've got it all wrong." That was for a company event. I gave flowers to everyone. I hadn't even said anything, but he was already explaining himself. He looked guilty, and it showed. I knew his secretary, Grace. Back when I was still working as the HR manager at our company, Grace was fresh out of college. She was a sweet girl with a warm smile, but her resume was too thin, and I hadn't planned on hiring her. Derek happened to stop by that day and saw her. He told me to give her a chance, saying, "She reminds me of you when you were younger." Even her name, Grace, was eerily similar to mine. Derek always had a way of looking at people with those soulful eyes of his, eyes that made everyone feel special. Back then, the way he looked at Grace didn't feel any different from how he looked at me. I was lost in thought when Derek pulled me into a warm embrace. He always hugged me when he wanted to reassure me. "Honey, there's nothing between me and her," he murmured softly in my ear. "Don't you trust me? Don't you trust the 15 years we've built together?" 15 years. From a naive 20-year-old to a 35-year-old woman with wrinkles at the corners of her eyes. After my parents passed away in an accident, I dropped out of college to start a business with Derek. I taught myself finance, HR, and computer science, often studying until my eyes were so strained I developed severe conjunctivitis. Our business partners used to call me the Iron Lady of the workplace. But now, I didn't even have the courage to question our relationship. "Derek, have you been unfaithful to me?" I asked. He clumsily gulped down the chicken soup I had brought him, coughing so hard it seemed to go down the wrong pipe. "Honey, I swear I didn't cheat. Please believe me." Derek has always been terrible at expressing his feelings. At that moment, I didn't want to dig any deeper. He promised me over and over that it wouldn't happen again. To prove it, he called Grace downstairs to apologize to me in person. Grace looked thinner than the last time I saw her. She wore black framed glasses that gave her the appearance of a student rather than an office worker. She apologized sincerely, saying, "Sis-in-law, I was just joking with someone else and accidentally sent the message to you. Please don't misunderstand." Her earnestness made me feel like I was being unreasonable. Standing there on the street, I felt utterly alone. In that moment, I realized I no longer loved him. Our marriage, which had once seemed like a beautiful tapestry, was now crawling with decay. For years, my life had revolved around him. I didn't know where I would go if I left, but I looked him in the eye and said, "Derek, I'll trust you this time." But my trust crumbled faster than I expected. That night, I found a used lip gloss on the bedside table. It was a sheer watermelon pink, a color I would never wear. I didn't cry. Instead, I let out a dry laugh at how ridiculous I felt. Maybe it was time to end this. By the time Derek came home, I had already packed my bags. He loosened his tie and froze when he saw me in my workout clothes. "Honey, where are you going?" he asked, his brows furrowing deeply. "Just going out for some fresh air." I smiled at him, as if it were any other ordinary evening. He sensed something was wrong and blocked my way. "Are you still upset about what happened today? Grace is young and immature. You don't need to be so petty." I looked at him seriously. Throughout our marriage, I had always been the one to accommodate and understand. I believed that as long as our differences weren't irreconcilable, there was no need to argue. Later, I read in a psychology book, a true breakup in a relationship isn't marked by arguments, it's marked by indifference. Perhaps I had stopped loving him long ago, but I hadn't realized it yet. "Derek, you even brought her into our house, and you're still pretending to be devoted?" I pointed at the lipstick lying out in the open and said mockingly. Derek's face darkened, and his hand instinctively moved to his stomach. He always got stomachaches when he was nervous. It was his telltale sign of guilt. After so many years, let's at least leave each other some dignity. He didn't say a word, just grabbed my shoulder and tried to snatch the suitcase from my hand. I couldn't match his strength, and he dragged me back into the house. His grip on my arm left a bright red handprint. The air inside was still filled with the rich aroma of chicken soup. It was the soup I had made earlier for lunch, using the exact seasoning he liked. I'd gone out early in the morning to buy the chicken for it. This routine, day after day, had been my life for years. Finally, he couldn't hold back his temper and snapped at me. "Emily, that's enough. Stop being unreasonable. Look at yourself. You're acting like a crazy woman. All the money I earn, I give to you. Can't you just be a little more rational? What did I do wrong?" I stared straight at him, making him flinch. If I could rewind time by 15 years, no, just 5 years, back when I hadn't quit my job, he would never have dared to say, "That's enough," to me. I laughed and pushed his hand away. "You slept with her on this bed, didn't you?" I said calmly. "I'm tired, Derek." His eyes turned bloodshot. "Emily, I love you so much. Please, don't leave me. I just made a stupid mistake. She reminded me so much of you when you were younger. I swear, it's you I love." What an elegant excuse for love. I told him, "But I don't love you anymore." I got into my car and drove away from the house. Derek followed me in his car the entire way until I stopped at a small house in the countryside. He got out of his car too, looking exhausted from a long day at work. "Emily, stop this. Where would you even go without me? All these years, apart from Grace, I've done nothing to betray you. Can't you try to understand me?" I took a deep breath, trying to suppress my emotions, and told him, "Derek, I'm an independent person, not a pet you're keeping." Is that so hard to understand? Hearing my words, he actually laughed. "All right, Emily, I promise I'll fire Grace tomorrow. You'll always be the woman of this house." Even at this point, he still thought I was just throwing a tantrum. Hopeless. Before I could say anything, his phone rang. He glanced at it and quickly silenced it. I knew it was Grace calling. When she couldn't reach Derek, she started messaging me on social media. I waved my phone at him and asked, "Want to take a look together?" Derek's face turned pale, and he shook his head instinctively. I opened the chat. Grace hadn't sent any text, just over 10 photos. The pictures documented everything, starting from when she first joined Derek's company to when she became his secretary. There was a photo of her leaning against a sleeping Derek's shoulder, photos of them shopping together, and even one where he gifted her a necklace. Each image captured their happiness in vivid detail. Derek's charming eyes still carried that same deep affection. 5 years. He had been having an affair for 5 years right under my nose. I held my chest, feeling my heart pound furiously. This aging heart of mine was riding the waves of despair. Derek still loved me. He worried about my safety, chasing me in his car for half an hour in the middle of the night. But he also loved Grace. His heart had split in two, each half belonging to a different person. I looked up. The sky was overcast, it was going to rain. Derek didn't say a word as he pulled an umbrella from the side of the car door and held it over my head. He was always so thoughtful. Then came the ding of a notification. It was another message from Grace. "Sis, I think we need to talk." At the cafe, she sat across from me. The wife and the mistress, sitting civilly together, it was oddly surreal. She cried as she spoke to me. "Sis, I never wanted to ruin your relationship. I just really love him." "Loving someone else's husband isn't exactly a commendable habit," I said with a smile. "What do you even like about him?" She hesitated for a moment before timidly replying, "He's rich, handsome, and honestly, he's a good person. He's never been with anyone else besides me." Rich and handsome. I almost laughed out loud. I couldn't help but think back to when I first met Derek. He had been working nights for his startup, so exhausted he collapsed onto the table. I had cooked porridge for him, but he was too tired to even drink it, falling asleep with his face in the bowl. Would Grace have liked him back then? She tried to persuade me. Men, they all like younger women. "Sis, I'm not asking for your forgiveness, and I don't want to take anything from you. I'll leave your life. I just hope you can forgive Derek." I shook my head and told her, "I've already prepared the divorce papers. I hope you and he can be happy together." Her gaze flickered, and she bit her lower lip as if wanting to say something. "Sis, I really do want Derek to be happy. What had Derek done to deserve such devotion from this young woman? I can feel that he still loves you, sis. Life is about compromise, isn't it?" She looked as if she were preparing to march to her doom. Grace really did resemble me, from her features to her demeanor, even down to her love for Derek. She reminded me so much of my younger self. I asked her, "So what's your plan? If you're not working at Derek's company anymore, where will you go?" Her face turned red. "Sis, I won't hide it from you anymore. Derek bought me a house. I work on some freelance projects on the side, so I can manage living alone in the future." Emily raised her phone to show me a photo. It was a new development. For someone of Derek's status, the price wasn't extravagant. The place looked increasingly familiar. Emily jangled a set of keys in her hand and said, "Sis, let me take you to my place. It's not right to keep this from you any longer." She drove me away from the cafe. When we arrived at her home, I finally understood why it felt so familiar. The house was still unfinished. From the floor-to-ceiling window, down below, not far away, there was a cluster of overgrown shacks, smoke curling from their chimneys, illuminated by the blood-red glow of the setting sun. For a moment, I was lost in a memory. Over a decade ago, a 20-year-old Emily and Derek had completed their first project on this barren land. He had said to me then, "Emily, when we make enough money, we'll never come back here. We'll move to the big city." I want to give you a life of luxury. We had embraced, listening to the rain pelting against the windows. At that time, even in the cramped little house, it felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. Now, standing here again, it felt like a lifetime ago. I finally understood the way Derek had looked at Grace a few years back. It wasn't just love, it was nostalgia. Nostalgia for the youthful days that could never return. Nostalgia for the beautiful beginning we had shared. He had transferred all the things he couldn't have in the past onto someone else. Derek, you disgust me. I couldn't stop myself from retching. The man I had once loved with all my heart was gone. He hadn't suddenly turned rotten. The decay had started long ago, in places I hadn't noticed, growing in the shadows. The moment it was exposed to the light, it disintegrated into nothing. Grace and I were equally pathetic. The difference was I had woken up. She was still trapped in delusion. Tears streamed down my face uncontrollably, like a broken string of pearls. Grace patted my back, visibly uneasy, repeatedly apologizing. Sis, I'm sorry. It's all my fault. I'm so sorry. I shook my head and, summoning all my strength, managed to say one sentence. I'm leaving now. Think it over carefully. My emotions were a tangled mess. I had left the divorce papers on the table. He should see them as soon as he got home. My phone rang. When I answered, Derek's tearful voice came through. Emily, do you really mean it? I'm just coming home to grab a few things. There's still a month left in the cooling-off period. Better to get used to it early. My words were a death sentence for him. When I returned home, the house was dark. Candlelight flickered. Derek sat at the dining table, holding a small box. He gestured for me to look inside. A Swarovski black swan necklace lay quietly within. In the early days of our business, we pinched every penny. I had lingered in front of a jewelry counter for a long time, eyeing a necklace. What 20-something girl doesn't dream of owning a decent piece of jewelry? The sales assistant enthusiastically asked if I wanted to try it on. I had no money and hesitated before declining. Derek had gripped my hand tightly. It was the first time I saw him embarrassed because of money. Now, under the candlelight, his eyes sparkled with tenderness. He said softly, I remember you always wanted a necklace. I went to the store today and bought it for you. Please, don't leave me. In the past, I had wanted it but couldn't afford it. Now, I no longer needed it. The black swan symbolizes unwavering devotion. Young men often use it as a token of love. But this necklace had also appeared in the photos Grace had sent me. Derek, your so-called devotion is cheap. I blew out the candles, turned on the lights, and went to the kitchen. I took out some chicken soup I had made a few days ago and reheated it on the stove. The savory aroma seemed to relax Derek. He even smiled at me nostalgically. Emily, I remember the first time I had a stomach issue. You made chicken soup for me, too. You went out in the pouring rain. His expression drifted, as if transported back to when we had leaned on each other. Back then, we had no money. I couldn't afford a whole chicken, so I scavenged for bones the butcher had discarded. Feeling sorry for me, the butcher secretly slipped me a few pieces of chicken thigh. Derek didn't know any of this. To him, I was the gentle, supportive partner who allowed him to chase his dreams wholeheartedly. That phase of his life was his utopia, but it wasn't mine. I turned off the stove, poured some soup into a bowl, and placed it on the table in front of him. After I leave, take care of your stomach. It'll still hurt if you don't. He froze. Emily, do you hate me? I shook my head. I don't hate you. For a fleeting moment, hope lit up his eyes, only to be extinguished by despair. He had understood what I meant. Hate is a luxury. It's an emotion deeper and more enduring than love. The opposite of love is indifference. Derek, sign the divorce papers. Let's go our separate ways. Emily, I can't divorce you. I'll die without you. I love you, I really do. I packed my things. In front of me knelt a man who seemed to have lost his mind. I had never seen him cry. Even during our hardest times, he always smiled and said, "Nothing can defeat us." The first time he shed tears was at our parting. "Emily, I won't sign the papers." "I know." I nodded. "Go spend more time with Grace. She's still young." After that day, he never contacted me again. I heard that Grace didn't break up with him, and the two of them have officially moved in together. I saw their public photos on Grace's social media. In those pictures, they looked so happy. Grace no longer wears glasses and looks more and more like a younger version of myself. She has finally gotten what she wanted. As for me, I needed a job and started sending out resumes. After Derek bought a house for his secretary, I had nowhere to turn. Years of being out of the job market, coupled with the fact that I was no longer young, made it hard for me to find work. A few days later, I finally landed a sales job. I lived alone in an old apartment, working from sunrise till late at night. I hadn't felt this exhausted in a long time. I remembered when Derek was so excited after his company went public that he twirled me around in the sunlight. His eyes sparkled as he said, "Emily, I'm going to make you the happiest person in the world." In his eyes, I could see my reflection, though it was blurry. Then I suddenly thought about how Derek used to call Grace Emily, too. It was as if doing so could ease his guilt. I thought life would continue this way, but fate had other plans. One day, while I was out meeting clients, a speeding Bentley slammed to a stop right in front of me. The impact knocked me down hard. On that scorching summer day, I found myself sprawled on the ground, my left side scraped raw. The Bentley's owner rushed to help me up and insisted on taking me to the hospital. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he said. I was in a hurry to meet with Mr. Derek for business. I couldn't believe it. Of all people, I was still somehow connected to Derek. What a cruel twist of fate. The diagnosis was a minor concussion and a fractured bone. After some basic treatment, the doctor informed me that I needed surgery and a family member's signature for consent. "Miss Emily, your phone is smashed. You can use mine to make a call," the doctor offered. I dialed that familiar number once, but no one answered. I tried again, still no response. Derek was always glued to his phone for work, so I couldn't understand why he didn't pick up. The doctor frowned. "A mess. Emily, without a family member's signature, we cannot proceed with the surgery." In desperation, I searched for Derek's contact on the doctor's social media. The top post on his profile was a photo of a new house. The caption read, "Congratulations, Emily, on your new home." The woman in the photo had long hair and was wearing a blue dress, just like I used to wear when I was younger. I stubbornly kept calling his number. Over the span of an hour, I called him 65 times. Finally, he picked up. I was nearly in tears. "Derek, I've been in an accident. Can you come sign the consent form for me?" On the other end of the line, Grace's sweet, bird-like voice abruptly stopped when she heard me. I felt pathetic. Despite having filed for divorce, in this moment of crisis, Derek was still the only person I could turn to. I met Derek when I was 20. I had no family, no support, no one to rely on. Back then, I worked in a diner serving breakfast. Derek, wearing his thick black glasses, always ordered the cheapest bowl of oatmeal. His stomach would growl loudly from hunger, and I felt sorry for him. I used to secretly share my employee meals with him. Over time, we grew close. Derek told me about his dreams, how he came from a small town to make it in the big city. Back then, college degrees were still rare and valuable. He had given up a high-paying job to chase his aspirations. Our relationship was never equal from the start. Looking back, I realized that Derek would have succeeded even without me. But his youthful passion was intoxicating. A broke college student and a dropout waitress, we were like characters from one of today's small-town romance novels. A tiny, shabby apartment, just the two of us clinging to each other through fleeting, bittersweet days. But life isn't a novel. The past, sharp as a blade, severed our ties. People say Derek misses the old me. But how could I not miss the man he used to be? Nostalgia cuts deeper than any wound. After the surgery, I was wheeled out of the operating room and saw Derek emerge from the restroom, holding an unlit cigarette between his fingers. He never used to smoke. He took my hand and began to sob softly. "Emily, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I never should have left you." The anesthesia blurred my vision, and I could barely make out his face. I caught a faint scent of paint on him, likely from his new home. "Derek, congratulations on starting your new life," I said, struggling to point to my bag. "The divorce papers are inside. Go ahead and sign them." His face darkened as he grabbed the stack of papers and tore them into shreds. The pieces fluttered down onto the bed. "I won't sign them, Emily. Not now. Please, just focus on recovering." I grabbed his wrist. He had lost so much weight lately that I could wrap my hand around it. A heavy silence filled the hospital room, suffocating us both. Derek trembled uncontrollably, barely able to stand. "Derek," I called his name. He turned to look at me, then suddenly shouted, "Emily, why do you have to make me suffer like this? I love you. I love you." I smiled gently, my voice calm but cold. "And what about Grace? What is she to you?" "She's kind. She's done nothing wrong to you." "Derek, answer me. Do you love me, or do you just love the 15 years we've spent together?" He said nothing. So I answered for him. "You already know the truth. You want everything. You want Grace's youth and beauty, but you can't let go of the 15 years we've shared. But there's no such thing as having it all, Derek. You can't have it both ways. The world doesn't work like that." And then, Derek wept. I was smiling. Grace stood outside, watching us. The entire scene felt absurd. Derek had always been a decisive person, but as he aged, he grew more selfish. I found him unrecognizable. I typed the lawyer's number into his phone. "The rest will be handled by my lawyer," I said. "Derek, it's time to end this." The lawyer later informed me that Derek refused to communicate. Grace called me several times, but I turned her down each time. There was no personal grudge between us and thus nothing to discuss. Finally, Derek called me himself. "Emily, let's meet one last time." He came to pick me up in my neighborhood, walking instead of driving. He took my hand and led me southward. I knew this route like the back of my hand. Years ago, I would wake up at 3 a.m. every morning and take this path to my job at a breakfast diner. The diner still looked the same. The owner, an old man with a hunched back, froze when he saw us. Then he broke into a warm smile, waving eagerly. "Emily, Derek, it's been years since you two stopped by." He still remembered us. "Derek's a big boss now," he added cheerfully. "What can I get you too?" "Just say the word." He enthusiastically set out 2 bowls for us. 2 bowls of soy milk and 2 buns, Derek ordered. When the food arrived, it tasted just as it used to. Derek didn't speak, slowly sipping his soy milk. I sat there, reliving the first step I'd ever taken to connect with society. "Emily." He called my name. "Back then, when I didn't have enough to eat, you always shared your food with me. But later I realized some things can't be shared. I don't want Grace anymore. I only want you." He pulled a simple silver ring from his pocket, engraved with my name. Inside his finger, the faintly visible letters LY, intertwined with the engraving, a tattoo he secretly got when we first married. I wanted everyone who saw me to know I already belonged to someone, he said. His gaze was sincere. Emily, I don't want anything else. I just want to be with you forever. His hands trembled as he tried to slip the ring onto my finger. Tears rolled down my cheeks, falling into the soy milk and creating ripples. Derek, it's too late. We're already over. Desperately, he tried again and again to put the ring on, but his shaking hands failed each time. The silver band left a faint red mark on my hand. I love you, he kept repeating over and over. I know, I replied. The promises we made in our youth no longer held meaning. I couldn't believe in new promises either. Life is too long, filled with too many uncertainties. Every tree and blade of grass in the old town remembered our youth, and that was enough. Derek's face turned pale as he crouched down on the ground. The diner owner, startled, rushed over. I reached out to touch Derek's forehead. It was burning hot. His chronic stomach condition was acting up again, leaving him curled up in pain. During the early days of his business, we had been so busy that he often skipped meals. I'm doing it for our future, he used to say. But after just a few months of endless networking and business dinners, he ended up in the hospital. He vomited relentlessly, eventually coughing up large amounts of blood. Back then, I was still grappling with the fear of losing my parents. Panicked, I held him tightly, calling his name over and over. My tears soaked through his shirt. You're so silly, Emily, he said, forcing a smile. It's just acute stomach ulcers. I pounded his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Derek, you're all I have left. Please, don't leave me. I'm begging you. I had never pleaded for anything so desperately in my life. At that moment, I would have traded my own health to save his. In our tiny rented apartment, I kissed him, tasting the metallic tang of blood mixed with my tears. He was my last lifeline. Derek, if you die, I don't want to live either, I whispered, clinging to his neck. And how did he respond? Oh, now I remember. He said, if I die, I want you to be happy. The next day, he took me to look at cemeteries. After circling around, we found them all too expensive. Defeated, we sat by the edge of the cemetery. He began discussing his final wishes with me. I have an old house and a car, he said. I borrowed over $30,000 to start the business. Even if I sell the house, it won't be enough to pay off the debt. If I ever pass away, just give up the inheritance, forget about my debts, and move far away. Forget about me completely. The air in the cemetery carried a constant earthy smell. I took a deep breath and rested my head on his shoulder. I don't want to forget you, I said. I'll always remember you. After we got home, I started learning to cook. During the day, I studied finance. At night, I practiced in the kitchen. I bought books on healthy eating and prepared meals to help heal his stomach. Life was hectic but fulfilling. I nursed his stomach back from the brink of collapse. 6 months later, the doctor praised me for taking such good care of him. You're the person who loves me the most in this world, Derek said. At the time, I believed that too. But when did everything change? Perhaps it was the fleeting glance at a resume in the office. Perhaps it was when he saw the harsh realities of the world. I didn't want to dig too deep. I helped Derek up from the ground, giving him a few words of advice. With your stomach, you should drink less soy milk. You're old enough to know how to take care of yourself. His face was ashen, his eyes bloodshot. Emily, I want your homemade chicken soup, he said. I sighed. How about I order you some delivery instead? He fell silent, choking back his pain as he asked, is there really no hope for us? I nodded. Then I called a rideshare to take him home. I was uneasy about letting the patient go home alone. The driver, an elderly man, glanced at the two of us sitting side by side in the back seat, and teased us with a smile. Young couple having a fight, huh? Without waiting for a response, he continued, I used to fight with my wife all the time when we were young, argued our whole lives, really. But that's how we got through it. It's a shame, though. The last time we fought, I didn't get a chance to apologize before she passed away. You young people need to treasure your feelings for one another. He hummed a tune, off-key and nostalgic, as if revisiting his memories. Derek squeezed my hand gently. After a long pause, he looked up and said to the driver, Sorry, sir. We're divorced. After Derek returned home, he signed the divorce papers. He left me the house and most of the company shares. He'd done everything he could to ensure I was taken care of and preserved our dignity. A month later, once the mandatory cooling-off period ended, he married Grace. At 20-something, it's easy to mistake infatuation for love. I understood her. Their wedding was held at the same venue where Derek and I had gotten married years earlier. 15 years had passed, and the place now bustled with new life and vibrancy. I attended their wedding. Grace beamed with happiness and came over to toast me. Emily, I'll take good care of Derek for you, she said, her hand adorned with a large diamond ring. Derek had clearly moved past the simple bands he used to give as gifts. It was good, really. He was finally able to give someone else the things he'd never given me. Grace, you're still young, I leaned in and whispered in her ear. Even if you take the wrong path, there's still time to turn back. Grace touched her flushed ear and turned to embrace the radiant groom on the stage. Derek, she called, smiling blissfully. Derek caught sight of me, his expression complicated. Words seemed to clog his throat, and in the end, all he managed was, Are you doing okay? I nodded. I'm fine. I hope you are too. We passed each other, mere strangers now. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him cry. Derek, don't cry. Your wedding night is supposed to be one of life's grandest occasions. I wish you a life of prosperity and happiness. Let's part on good terms. I hadn't anticipated how quickly their marriage would fall apart. I had just sold the house and some of the shares and hadn't even found a new place to live when I heard they were getting a divorce. Apparently, Derek had gotten involved with a new intern and Grace, pregnant at the time, caught them red-handed. The intern looked even more like me than Grace did, confident, vibrant, and even skilled in cooking. Grace came to me in tears. Pregnancy had aged her by at least a decade. She no longer had the radiant confidence she'd displayed on her wedding day. Emily, she sobbed, I don't know what to do. I have nothing without him. Those words sounded so familiar. It was as if I were stuck in a time loop, watching my own past self, a year earlier, sitting alone in a hospital, crying that he was all I had. She was heavily pregnant, on the verge of collapse. Why did it turn out like this? We could have been so happy. Men are like glass. At first, they're crystal clear and flawless. You think you can keep them that way forever. But once a crack appears, the entire thing shatters into pieces. To sacrifice your entire life for someone like that, it's not worth it. I advised her to terminate the pregnancy. Grace, last year you told me that even if you left him, you could still work from home and make a living. There's no such thing as a fairy tale where someone can't live without another person. Get rid of the baby and start fresh. She stared blankly at me. I knew she needed time to process. Just like me, it had taken 15 years of my youth to free myself from the whirlpool of love and heartbreak. Thankfully, she was still young. The last time I heard anything about Derek was 3 years later. By then, I had used the money from selling the house and shares to start a small AI company. I'd caught the wave of an emerging industry and made a fortune. Grace worked with me for a while but eventually decided to live a quiet life on her own. She'd always been the adaptable, soft-hearted type, and I respected her choice. One day, a business partner casually brought up some gossip about a certain company owner. "Emily, did you hear? That famous entrepreneur from the neighboring city, Derek, passed away from stomach cancer." My pen froze mid-signature, and a drop of ink marred the contract, rendering it useless. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Who were you talking about?" The partner sighed. "You know, Derek, the young entrepreneur in his 30s. Stomach cancer, late stage. By the end, he was skin and bones. We really need to take care of our health. Money can always be made again, but life, well, you only get one." I nodded in agreement, though my heart felt hollow. A sourness crept into my chest and spread to my nose. "Oh, by the way, Emily," the partner added, "this guy was something else. Left a will saying all his company shares should go to his ex-wife." Huh. Everyone in our circle knew about his reputation as a playboy. If he really loved his wife that much, things wouldn't have ended in divorce in the first place. I couldn't focus on what he was saying anymore. My thoughts drifted to the cemetery we had once snuck into as kids. Back then, Derek had told me he wanted me to forget him, to let go and find happiness. And now, he wanted to tie me to him with a company. How selfish. Derek's lawyer contacted me to handle the inheritance transfer. After some consideration, I arranged for his assets to be donated to charitable organizations. I kept nothing for myself. I thought it would bring bad luck. That evening, I hailed a cab to go home. As soon as I got in, the driver recognized me. It was the same cabbie from 3 years ago, the one who had driven us on the day of our divorce. He'd moved to a new city for work. He said his wife's grave was nearby. Whenever he drove past this area for work, he always felt a sense of returning to where it all began. As we were nearing home, he suddenly asked me, "Hey, miss, how are things between you and your husband?" I closed my eyes and replied, "He's gone to a place far away, to the time when we were both 20, a time we can never return to." At the edge of time, he reached out his hand to me and said, "Emily, meeting you in this life was truly worth it." I pushed his hand away. My journey still stretches far ahead. I have a healthy body, a rich and independent mind, and I won't let myself be confined by anyone. My bright and boundless future will no longer bear traces of belonging to someone else, and I couldn't ask for anything better.